Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the EIP-Agri Capacity Building webinar. My name is James Claffey, Project Manager of CAP Network Ireland, and you're all very welcome to this webinar today. This webinar is organised by CAP Network Ireland on behalf of the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. Through Ireland's CAP Strategic Plan, the Department of Agriculture is hoping to build on the success of the previous 57 EIPs, and they have created a number of thematic calls moving forward to help implement Ireland's CAP Strategic Plan 2023-2027. We have two of these thematic calls at the moment in terms of animal health and welfare and gender balance in agriculture in Ireland. So congratulations to all the attendees today who have reached stage 2. It's fantastic to see such a positive response to the calls, and look very much forward to seeing the projects in action down the line. The purpose of today's webinar is to help the attendees and the people that were successful to reaching stage 2 to complete their full project plan and give them the tools and resources to make the best possible application to showcase what they plan to do over the length of their project. So we're going to do that in a number of different ways today, and you can see the agenda there on screen. I suppose just to point out that the purpose of this webinar is not to deal with individual inquiries from particular projects, but it's an overall webinar to give you the tools and resources to it. If you have individual queries that you might need answering, the department have created dedicated email addresses. We have a fairly stacked agenda and panelists here today, which I will introduce as the webinar goes on. Just in terms of the agenda, first of all, I'm going to ask Michelle from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to have a presentation from our colleague Tracy O'Donoghue on the project plan costs. Next, my own colleague David Barry is going to present on the project plan guidance, so the different sections that are involved and tips and resources that might be useful for you. We're going to quickly break down for some Q&A session. So if there's any questions that you have, please do enter them in the questions and answers box at the top of the screen, and we'll hopefully get to as many as we can. Then we're going to pause for a very quick 5 minutes or less, just a comfort break for people to get up and stretch their legs and refresh. Followed by that, we're going to come back into the second session of today's webinar, where my colleague Sarah Glasgow from Éireann is going to present on your communication plan. Then Tony Ward from the Breeding Waders EIP is going to talk to us a little about the financial plan and the governance of your project. Really important topics to be aware of when you're writing your project plan. And then Anne McGuire from the department is going to go through the operation group guidance. And again, we'll have Q&A to finish off and closing remarks. I suppose before we kick off in terms of the presentations today, just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. The webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards. We will endeavour to get the recording out to people by the end of this week, if possible. So just so that everyone has access to it, and even people that weren't available to attend today. The chat is being monitored by my colleagues, and if you have any technical issues or problems, please email Paddy at irishrural.ie. Paddy, if you don't mind, you can even throw your email into the chat there just so that people can have it. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible today, but as I said, there is a dedicated email address and there will be an information pack circulated after today's event. So hopefully that should address all your queries, but please do reach out to ourselves or the managing authority through their dedicated emailers, and I'm sure they will make that available throughout the webinar today. So that's very quickly just housekeeping, and please do add your questions throughout the different presentations going on, and we'll take as many as we can. So I'm going to very quickly stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite our first speaker to turn on their camera and say hello to everyone. So that is Michelle Kearney, Principal Officer of the locally led section in the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, James, and good afternoon, everybody. So as James said, my name is Michelle Kearney. I lead up the locally led division within the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and I have specific responsibility in leading the strategic direction of the European Innovation Partnerships. Just to pick up on a couple of points that James mentioned, the EIPs are a very important element of our CAP strategic plan from 2023 to 2027. And these two particular calls are very much focused on animal health and welfare and increasing the gender balance on Irish farms. I suppose what I would say is that EIPs are a very good opportunity to drive innovation at local level. They are and have been seen to be very successful in testing ideas, in testing concepts that as policymakers and as departments, we can scale up those learnings to national schemes. So even to give you an example of the EIPs over the last rural development programme, they very much have informed now our flagship agri-environmental scheme acres within the CAP strategic plan. I would also like, and I suppose as James has said, to congratulate you all. It has been a great achievement to get to this stage. I'm looking forward to an opportunity to hear about, I suppose, how you write your proposal in more detail. I look forward to reading those proposals in more detail as well. And I suppose and I know that time is kind of quite of the essence here. So I just want to leave you with a little word. And I mean, I suppose this is what is the essence of EIPs and what describes EIPs. It's around addressing local challenges. It's been locally driven by local stakeholders, local communities to actually drive local solutions. So thanks, James. I'm going to leave it there and hand back to yourself as chair.
Thanks very much, Michelle, for that. So look, I'm not going to delay any longer. Tracy, I'm going to pass it over to you to go through the project plan costing slides. If you want to share your screen, please.
Yeah, that's grand. Thanks very much, James. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the support costs for developing the project plan. So there's up to 10,000 available from the department to actually develop your project plan. The development costs covered activities that are associated with the preparation of the project plan only. Okay. So what costs are available? So there's eligible costs. They relate solely to the development of the proposal. So any expenditure incurred after the proposal submission is not eligible for reimbursement. The eligible costs include project team costs, which is like administrative support, travel and subsistence. So if there's any travel involved, we're meeting up with who's writing the project proposal or meeting with the operational group. But these costs will be capped at 20% of the overall claim for support. So that's important. They will be capped at up to 2,000. So professional services, these consultancy services costs, they will be capped at 60% of the overall costs for overall cost claim for support. So ineligible costs include, but they're not limited to, overheads, which includes office space, purchases of computers, stationery, that kind of thing, conferences or seminars for tenants. Any travel outside of Ireland will not be covered. Any costs not related to the development of the proposal. And any expenditure that is incurred prior to the date of the phase 1 application that was approved by the department is also ineligible. So submitting a claim to the department. The first thing is you can submit your development costs on a template that will be given after this webinar. The department will either approve or disapprove the funding. If your funding is approved, then your costs will be reimbursed. However, all claims are retrospective, so there's no advance funding available. Payments can only be made to the legal entity that is part of the operational group. So for example, if a project lead is an individual, the payment will not be made to the project lead, but it will be made to an entity within that operational group. The phase 2 project plan must be submitted before any reimbursement costs will be considered. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Thanks very much, Tracy, for that. And it's great to see, I suppose, that the support is there for groups to develop their project plan going forward. You know, as Michelle alluded to, this is a bottom up and it's local level, so it's great to have that support for groups. Look, we're going to take questions and answers after our next speaker, and I see some coming in already. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dave Barry, who works for us, the Cap Network Ireland, but also MTU. So Dave, over to you to speak about the application form itself for the project plan.
Hey, thanks, James. And firstly, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We are conscious of the range of participants in this call, and people's differing abilities. So we'll try and make it as general as possible. So yeah, the first thing, chapter 1, this is really a concise summary of your application, given like an overview, and really at this stage you'd be linking your application to the call and the call guidelines. I suppose the first thing I'd say at this stage is it might be worthwhile actually printing off the call guidelines so you're continually returning back to them at all parts of your application for this stage. In this executive summary as well, it's probably worthwhile if you can include some charts and images, or maybe kind of a flow chart of how the project will work. It'll give the evaluators a really quick overview of your application. With the department have released the guidelines, and with all the guidelines, they've also given a guideline of a word count. I suppose it's worthwhile to try and keep within the count as much as possible, and be conscious that the evaluators will be looking at multiple projects. So, keep it as concise as possible will definitely be in your benefit. I suppose at this stage as well, you will refer back to the fact that it's a local challenge and it's also a ground-up innovation that you're looking at. So once again, continually referring back to the guidelines. And this part of the project, the executive summary, should also be it should be a standalone document that'll give a broad summary of it, and possibly it might be worthwhile actually completing this at the end of your application, whenever you've kind of put everything together in place. So then your abstract, the abstract really is a quick summary of the objectives of the project, the activities that will be carried out, the leader, the contact point, the categories that you're looking at, and keywords, maybe 4 to 5 keywords that describe your project and what you plan on doing, the territorial scope and the geographic area that you plan on carrying out the work in your project, the extended time you're planning on working from, between 3 to 5 years is the suggested idea, and the budget. This could be quite short, and also this information will probably be shared at some stage if we were announcing the successful projects. This is the kind of information that will be shared by the department, so bear that in mind as well. So then chapter 3 really will be your approach. Firstly, you'll be looking at the objectives, what you hope to achieve, and how you're building on the current state of knowledge in your specific thematic area. And then the approach, the unique approach really that your operational group are suggesting to use for this, and the associated costs then with those approaches, be they participant farmers in the project or contractors that you plan on using. And then really the constraints, the issues that you're going to kind of encounter as you work through your project, and how you're going to ensure quality of research and quality of carrying out your project. At this stage then as well, it's you're going to have to talk about the impact of your project, the results that you're expecting to have out of the project, and recommendations that may emerge from the work that the project will carry out over the time period. The return, then you might pick some key indicators that you can evaluate your project. You'll be going back to this again when you pick your KPIs. At this stage, really, you're identifying the challenge and the objective that your project has, and also a kind of a rough plan of the activities that you're going to carry out, breaking it down into tasks and subtasks, and then really the ways you're going to evaluate whether a task was successful. So you're identifying the metrics that you're going to use to evaluate your project, and this will carry through as well through the whole of your application. The team, as you'll see when you look at the evaluation criteria, the makeup of the operational group accounts for 30% of the mark. So it's really important that you have a really strong operational group, but also that you identify all of the skills and the abilities of each member of your operational group, and try and analyze your group to make sure you have the required skills for everything you say you're going to carry out. At this stage, you can still add an extra member to your operational group, and you have to be conscious of that if you identify a weakness within your group, now is the time to try and add that member. So at this stage, you're going to talk about the relevant experience of all the individuals and the qualifications, almost like a CV, and then how the team will work together, the time commitment per person. So it's really important that you identify the FTEs working on the project. That will also link then to your financial plan, which we look at in a minute, and also to the workload that's going to be carried out. And this has to be a realistic expectation. You can, at this stage as well, you can have zero pay members of your operational group. So they can have a role within the operational group, but you don't have to allocate full-time hours to them at this stage. This is quite a long stage though, because as I said, it's 30% of the mark. So you will be kind of, with each CV, sometimes people will submit these in a table form where they'll give the name of the person and then their CV and the experience and their work experience in the past, whether it be on EIPs or other projects. And then also how they'll react and what they will contribute to the project. It's very important that not only allocate an FTE to the individuals, but also what specific skill they're bringing to the team and the relevance that that individual can bring to the role. It's a successful rollout of the project. The financial plan, where someone else is going to go through the financial plan in more detail, but really you can look at things, the costs of running the project, then potential farmer payments, and then operational across the day-to-day costs. If you break it down, carry out a proper budget, you have to be realistic as well in your estimation. You're not going to know exactly what all your costs are, but you have to make realistic estimations of what the costs will be and the procedures that you plan on putting in place to make your payments and how you're going to manage your cost records and how you're also your financial reporting back to the department. At this stage as well, this is quite a focused element of the application, but also it will refer back or will refer on to Chapter 6, which is when you look at your timelines and milestones, which is essentially a Gantt chart, and you can allocate then your financial costs really will use your Gantt chart or your timeline chart to see where the costs will be, i.e. if you, in the second year of the project, if you plan on doing a lot of site visits, well, then you'll be aware that you'll have to increase your travel and subsistence allocation for year 2, or vice versa if it was one of the other years of the project. So for your key milestones, as I said, the Gantt chart will be really helpful here for the evaluators and for yourself moving forward. And then you just you can monitor and control what's going to be achieved. At this stage, you'd also what procedures you're going to have in your Gantt chart, how you can evaluate the success of the project, not just at the end, but as you work through the timeline of the project. And then you can identify the performance indicators that you're going to use for this evaluation. It has to align with what you plan on doing here at this stage. So, your Gantt chart will really dictate how you work out the rest of the project. And then, so the risks and contingencies. So at this stage, it's recommended to carry out a simple SWOT analysis of your operational group and your project plan. Identify the risks that you see as being likely and the possibility or the opportunity of them happening, and then kind of identify mitigation procedures that you'd suggest at this stage. Like some of the things that we've kind of encountered in the past with EIPs would maybe be like a participant farmer not carrying out the work allocated to them. And then at this stage in this part of the application, you might suggest these are the mitigation measures we'll have, the number of phone calls or letters we'll make to that individual, and then how we will record them. And then at that stage, if we remove a participant farmer, do we have a substitute, or can we just carry on with the reduced number? If you identify these risks at this stage, well, then it'll contribute to the fluid running of the project once you get up and going. As well, at this stage, you should identify how you're going to deal with data and how you're going to store it and protect that data in line with best practice and guidelines that will be submitted. And then also how you're going to procure equipment and how to manage it and depreciate it as well. I suppose then the next stage is dissemination and the outreach plan. Sarah is going to talk about communication, which is really important, and that'll be a lot of that will kind of feed back into your dissemination plan. So if you keep an eye out for that as well. One of the things at this stage as well is we are CAP Network Ireland. One of our roles is to promote and disseminate EIPs, so that will be available to you if you're successful throughout the running of the project. And if you want to disseminate results, invite individuals or any kind of areas involved in the communication, CAP Network will always be available to you. So just a few really quick general tips. Read the guidelines, as I suggested before, maybe print them off and understand and continually link back your application to the guidelines. Refer to the EU handbook and the CAP Network Ireland websites for past and current EIPs or ones that you've been involved in yourself, or also throughout your network to people who have applied for them in the past, and see if they can give you any suggestions and tips. Make sure your application is in line with Ireland's CAP strategic plan and how you can identify and highlight how your project actually addresses one of the areas raised in Ireland's CAP strategic plan. At this, we'll go back again to the operational group, make sure you have the correct operational group and you can fulfill everything that you plan on doing with your operational group. The application start as early as possible. A lot of people will say that 2/3 of successful applications are actually started in the first 10% of the time allocated for the application. So the earlier you start, it's better. And obviously try and submit it early as well to make in case of any technical problems. Structure it in a logical way and align it with the call, but be realistic as well. Like, you have to make sure that you can actually carry out the things you will suggest you can do. And, if you are successful, you might get a shock then if you've been unrealistic. So you will actually have to do the things that you say you can do. The budget must match the workload, as we said already, and use the guidance and the templates in the call as much as possible. And it's suggested that you have somebody from outside your operational group who's not familiar with your specific project, but has experience in EIPs or other project funding calls, and ask them to read it. They might spot differences or omissions that you, as somebody who's worked on it, may not notice. So that if you give them a day or two before you submit it, that could be beneficial. And keep it straightforward, avoid repetition. Try not to take wording directly from the call document and put it into your application, because the people who wrote the call document will be evaluating it and they don't want to see it. And also try not to repeat the same information multiple times throughout your application. If you say it once in the right field or in the right chapter, well, then it's said and people will be aware of it. Clearly explain the relevance of your challenge and your partnership to the call, and demonstrate why this problem is important and how your application or your project proposal can actually deal with an issue that's been identified. So this, once again, this refers back to the connection between your project and the aims and the objectives of the CSP, and explain how you will comply with all legal obligations. Once again, this is part of the application at this stage, and just demonstrate as much as possible how your operational group is particularly well suited to carry out your proposed EIP, and plan the activities as well to maximize the impact of your project. So if you can, when you're working through the project, kind of consider things like, is it transferable to other regions within Ireland or other European countries as well? Because this is one of the potential outcomes of EIP, that it is transferable and can be used across multiple areas and regions within the European Union. So once again, the criteria, these are fundamental to your application. And then that's it for now. So that's it.
Thanks very much,
No
Dave,
worries.
for that. A lot of really good information and tips and resources there for people to kind of use when they're writing their application. I suppose just to point out again that the presentations and the recording will be shared, because obviously there's a lot of information there. I'm sure people will want to go back again when they're sitting down to actually write the application. One thing that's really picked up there, Dave, is that statistic: the earlier you start, the more successful that you're likely to be in being successful in becoming an operational group. So that's something to bear in mind. I'm going to deal with some of the questions that come through on the questions and answers session now at the moment. So if I can ask the previous speakers to please turn on their camera. I know Michelle and Tracy have been joined by some of their colleagues as well within the department, and maybe they might be able to field some of these questions as well. So I suppose, Tracy, to yourself and Michelle first, kind of a very simple question to start off with. When will the application form be released to the groups on the call today?
We're hoping to have the application forms and guidance notes out tomorrow. And I think
Perfect.
the webinar then for yourselves is later in the week. So
Yes, we will, as I said, we will aim to have ours out by Friday at the latest, to people just to go over it as well. There is a question, I suppose, around for the department to look at the funding, the 10,000 that you've kind of mentioned, Tracy, as well. People have kind of just outlined that it can be quite difficult for smaller groups to absorb that 10,000, but I would imagine that has to be based on money spent rather than money front loaded, I suppose. So I don't know if you want to respond to that yourself as well.
yeah, absolutely. I'm afraid, yeah, the application has to be in before the funds can be given. In the case that we had given, funds to people and then the application doesn't come in. So I'm afraid it has to be application first and then we give out the funds then after.
Great, thanks very much, Dave. I think there's a couple of questions here for you as well, if you wouldn't mind taking them. Just one here. two in particular. First of all, what does FTE stand for? And second of all, how much detail is required for the task and the subtask?
Yeah, so firstly, FTE refers to a full-time equivalent. So the department have issued guidance that it's a 40-hour work week. So you could, in this, if you have somebody working on the project for, their full working week and you've allocated the full salary to them, you'd say that'd be one FTE. But there is a possibility as well to allocate, a portion of someone's FTE. So it'd be quite common to allocate maybe a quarter or a half of an FTE to somebody that they'll be working on that project for half their working week, 20 hours a week. So that's how you can allocate it. And then once you're in your application, once your FTEs match then the allocated workload as well. Sometimes people will have a 0 FTE allocated to them with a small bit of work that they'll be done, but that's fine once there's no cost associated with them. And the details of the task and the subtask, well, I would say I'd recommend at this stage that you do it in a table form. And so if you have, say, if you have 5 tasks or whatever, you have 5 tables, and then you have a drop-down subtable within that table then for each subtask. Really, the detail is once there's enough information in your description of the task that you can allocate the time it will take. So maybe say month 1 to month 12, say if it's going to take place in the first year, then the individuals will be working on the task, and then a verbal or word description of the task that clearly identifies what you will do, and then the KPIs from that particular task. And then if you break down in the subtask, then you know what you will do. But once your description is adequate and sufficiently describes what you do in the task, that's how long it has to be, from my experience with past applications.
Thanks, Dave. Michelle, for yourself, and Tracy, here's what is the deadline for the application itself?
The deadline for the development costs is the 22nd of July. And the deadline then for the application for the phase 2, the developing the project plan, is the 30th of September.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's just another question here as well. Are there examples of previous EIPs that could be shared around that groups could access? I would imagine these are confidential documents that the previous operation groups would have formed, so I would imagine they can't be shared. But obviously, there's people that worked in these operation groups that I'm sure are happy to lend their experience and advice to people if they're approached. Is that a fair comment, Michelle?
I think so, James, and as well, look, we would have some final reports up on our website as well, or available, so they could be shared and would give, I suppose, potential bidders an idea and a flavour of the types of projects.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and also on the National Rural Network website and Cabinet Garden website, there's reports as well and descriptions of previous projects that you can use for reference as well. I think Dave alluded to it as well in terms of the project abstract as well. That's a really important standalone piece of work that the group should be very much conscious of, because that abstract will be shared on a multitude of platforms, including the EU Commission website. So if people are successful, we will reach out and get that project abstract to disseminate it across Europe. So even though it's very small in terms of the word count, etc., it's a really important document when you're creating it. There's a couple of kind of comments has been made around, the operational group itself. And if you look at the selection criteria, there's a lot of weight towards the formation of the operational group and the structure. David, I think you mentioned it as well. It's not too late, I suppose, to find new partners for the operation group if you feel that there is a deficit in certain areas of your proposal, and this is the time to identify. So, Dave, I don't know if you want to expand maybe a little bit more of that, and maybe even how Cap Network can maybe assist these groups if they find themselves in a deficit for some certain skill set.
Yeah, well, definitely, it's definitely not too late, and the department guidelines do indicate that up until the submission of your phase 2 application, you can add additional members to your operational group. Really, such a high percentage of the marks apply, 30% apply to the makeup of the operational group. So I would recommend after today, if everyone who's applied as part of your operation group at this stage, schedule a call. And basically, if everybody was just to do an analysis of your group and see is there anything missing from your group, and then how you could plug it, maybe contact your own networks or stretch out, or you can contact ourselves in the CAP network, and we're always happy to put people in connection, be it with an industry partner or an academic partner. and you know, see, can you add to your operational group? And at this stage as well, I did forget to mention in my presentation as well, I suggest scheduling a weekly call for all members of your operational group from now until the submission, just you know, and maybe even sometimes I found in the past actually preparing a Gantt or a chart just for the application process as well, with timelines of what you want done and when it should be done by over the next 10 to 12 weeks as well. I suggest just to kind of streamline your application.
Thank you very much. Michelle and Tracy, I suppose there's a question here as well around the could the if the EIPs are the previous applications are sensitive, can they be redacted and circulated? I would imagine that is a no, that if you approach a previous group and if they're happy to share, but it wouldn't be your place to share it.
Absolutely not, James. Look, I mean, this is GDPR. This is confidential proposals that have come into this department. So unfortunately, no. But what I would also say, James, and I know you have related to, and you've referred to your own website through the CAP network, but even the EIP-Agri on the EU side also gives you really good flavour of the types of projects there, and I suppose what is expected from abstracts as well. So there's a lot of information there that people can draw on in terms of preparing a proposal and getting a good understanding of what's expected from the proposal, but also what's expected then as the project is actually delivered.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Just in terms of, there's a couple of questions here in terms of employing people. For longer EIPs, which this is 3 to 5 years, is it more useful to employ staff or contract services, especially administration staff? And a link to that as well, if you're planning to hire someone to work on the project, if it is successful, should you include this hypothetical person in the operation group?
So maybe if I just comment
Michelle, I don't know
first
if you want to maybe take
on,
that, Tracy. Yeah.
yeah, so maybe if I just comment first on the staff piece. So I suppose this is down to an operational group to decide themselves in terms of which is more economically effective here. Because, I mean, what we're looking at here, these are operational groups that will also need farmer engagement. So we need to balance that administrative cost and that particular element of the project with the farmer payment element. So it would be up to each operational group to decide amongst themselves, have they the capacity and capability within their own group to do the administrative work, or is it better from a cost-effective perspective to actually subcontract that work out? And that probably leads me on to the second question about if you're going to subcontract somebody in to do some work for the project. In my view, that should be separate to the operational group. So it is a service that you, as the operational group, will actually be bringing in for a fixed period of time. And contractors' works are allowed. There's some eligible costs, and Tracy may have some more detail, but contractors are allowed as long as there is still, I suppose, benefit to the farmer.
It's, Dave, we just mentioned that 30% of the marking is going, I think, for the structured operation group and the team, etc. What is the rest of the marks going for? I think you had it in your presentation there. You're just in me, Dave, I think, as well.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, James. Sorry, I'll just quickly go back to the slide. So, yep, marking structure. Sorry, cut me off. Sorry, the relevance and impact of your proposal as well is 25%. So really, this brings back to how relevant your proposal is to the call and also to the CAP strategic plan for Ireland as well, and the impact that you plan on having throughout your project. The quality of the proposal itself, this is 35%. So this is really down to how it fits within the criteria outlined by DAFM for the phase 2 application plan. So the word count, obviously the the English bit essentially, and how well it reads. And a lot of this is actually down to just the work that you put into actually editing a quality proposal. And then the quality of the operational group, as you said already, 30%. And then the risk and contingency is 10%. So how identifying the risks, identifying your mitigation strategies and how you're going to reduce them, and your plans for running a successful project. This comes back to, I suppose in Ireland, like things like, say, COVID-19 happened, and this is when we really were highlighted the fact that, if we identify risks and how we can mitigate them going forward in the future, and there, no one's going to foresee something like that, but you have to be reactive as well. But you can put as much work as possible into this stage of your project so you can overcome any serious issues for the successful running of your project.
Thanks very much, Dave, for that. Tracy, just as a question here on dates as well, so I'll just go back to you if that's okay. So can you just clarify the dates again, the July date, the September date, and then I suppose the actual start date for successful projects, if you had any idea on that?
So for the application for the development costs, that the deadline for that is the 22nd of July at 5 o'clock. And the application form, the detailed project plan, the deadline for that is the 30th of September at 5 o'clock. And then it is hoped that probably by the end of October that they would be going to full implementation phase.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Michelle or Tracy, I don't know if either of you wants to take this one. How closely does the project plan need to align with the initial expression of interest form that was submitted at stage 1?
You're on mute, Michelle.
Apologies.
Apologies. So James, yes, so through our own screening process, we would have identified a number of expressions of interest that we felt that met the objectives in terms of animal wealth and welfare and gender on Irish farms. So we would hope that the expressions of interest would still align. Now, there is some scope there to expand that. And as Dave had said, there's scope to expand the operational group. But the ultimate objective and I suppose the concept of the expressions of interest now needs to be brought forward into the project plan. I suppose crucially, all of the time, these proposals need to demonstrate how they link back to the objectives as set in our CAP strategic plan.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And just another question there as well. Can members of the operation group be participating farmers? I suppose, is there any conflict there?
I might leave that one to Tracy.
Yeah, no, that's not a problem. No, they can be participant farmers and they can be on the operational group.
Perfect. And I would imagine it's even encouraged to have, buy-in from local farmers and have them part of the operation group as well as a key component.
Well, that's it. As Michelle was saying earlier, it's locally led. So it's a bottom-up approach. So the farmers are actually very important. And just actually, before we move on, can I just actually say that the guidelines and the application forms they're coming out afterwards, they have all the dates and the templates and everything that's required for the submissions of both the development costs and the project plan.
Thanks very much, Lizzie. We'll finish on this question as well. Can complementary funding be sought to enhance the EIP? So could you look for complementary funding through a different funding stream to enhance the project? Michelle or Tracy, I don't know if either of you wants to take that.
I haven't seen that previously, James, and it's something that probably we would have to look through in terms of the regulation, and we can get back with a more detailed answer. But my gut feeling would be no at this point in time, that these are projects within their own right that are contained and have set funding. But we can certainly clarify that further.
Yeah. Perfect. And I presume that will be kind of taken on a case by case as the project develops as well. Will a potential election delay any works? So someone's very conscious of the political landscape at the moment.
Absolutely not, James. We continue here, irrespective of whether there's an election or not, right? So we will still commit to our deadlines.
Perfect. Thanks very much to our three speakers so far. So look, it is now 2:41. So I'm just going to call for a quick comfort break for 4 minutes. So if everyone can come back at 2:45, we will kick off with our next session. And thanks to everyone for the questions and presentations so far. We'll see you all in 4 minutes. Okay. I hope everyone managed to get themselves just a breath of fresh air before we kick off the second session. So look, as I said, we've heard about the project plan and all the different elements. I suppose the next section of this webinar is going to go through some of those in more detail and provide participants and attendees with as much detail as possible to enhance their application. So first of all, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Sarah Glascott, who's Communications Officer with Claffey Network Ireland and Earn Innovation, who's going to just quickly give us a rundown on developing a communications plan and all the different tools and things that you need to consider while doing. So Sarah, I will stop scaring now and pass over to you.
Perfect. All right. So this is going to take us through developing a communications plan. Okay. So this is a really key piece of work where you can show the value and impact of the project, not only to the department and project participants, but also to wider stakeholders as well. When you're developing your communications plan, it's important to think about what you actually want to communicate, who you want to communicate with, and how you're going to do it. It's also important to plan how you're going to evaluate your communication activities as well before you start. The 5 points here, they serve as a good starting point for your planning, and I'll go into more detail about them on the next slides. But roughly, we've got think about your goals, your audience, who your target stakeholders are and why they'd be interested, the different kinds of channels where you can reach them and the best time to reach them as well. What are your key messages and how can you measure impact as well? Okay, so just looking at goals, the image here is taken from guidance for large-scale European research projects, but similar principles do apply for the EIPs as well. Looking at those 3 boxes, the green circles are the key pieces of information to focus on, and it's good to be aware of the difference between the types of activities and also how they might change over the project's lifetime. Different approaches might be required and the target audiences might be different as well. So why are we doing this? It's good to break down your goals for the project, understanding that outreach is promoting your actions and activities to a wider audience. Dissemination is making your results public, and exploitation, or in this case, lessons learned, that's what you do with your results towards the end and beyond your project. Knowing what your goals are helps to map out how you achieve this. For example, if you're raising awareness among a local community of the challenge and how you're solving it, that will be outreach. Sharing your solution so others can inform themselves and potentially get involved is dissemination. And then organizing a workshop or meetings with key stakeholders so that the solution, if it's effective, can be used beyond the project lifetime would fall under lessons learned. Next, we'll move to target audience or audiences. Often there's more than one audience. It's really important to determine your target audience before you produce any communication assets or go to the time and effort of setting up websites or social media pages. Who do you want to see your information? Who do you want to engage with? And how are you going to do that? How are those stakeholders accessible? So we do recommend spending a bit of time mapping out the stakeholders and their motivations. And you also need to consider why they might be interested and how you might capture their interest. Also important is to consider the frequency of communications. You don't want to bombard someone with constant email updates. That will most likely result in them unsubscribing. And then once you've established your target audience or audiences, you can start looking at the best types of channels for communicating your information. Some of the different communication tools you might use to reach your audience include videos, interviews, a blog post, newsletters, social media posts, reports, or in-person events. And you'll share that information through a variety of mediums, whether it's through websites, social media, webinars, workshops, open days, and so on. Again, looking at how best to reach your target audience. If you're hoping to reach people, for example, in their early 20s, odds are you'll find them on social media platforms, maybe like TikTok. But if you're hoping to reach people in their 50s, you might consider Facebook or more traditional mediums like emails or workshops. LinkedIn may work best for companies as well, for example. It's also very important to consider the different levels of user confidence, especially when it comes to technology-based communication. Is your target audience comfortable with logging into a webinar, for example? Would they prefer a flyer in the post? This is why determining your audience at the beginning is so important, as it forms the base for all other types of communication activities. It's also the useful platforms. There's quite a few. This is just a handful. You may need to consider budget if you want to use some of these to their fullest potential. Canva, for example, is very useful for creating infographics, mind maps, brochures, and so on. It does have a free service, but it also has a paid version. So you'll need to consider your goals or your preferred communication assets, and then the budget as well. Email marketing platforms like MailChimp, they make sending newsletters very easy, and there's a huge selection of templates available to help make your newsletter look as professional as possible. Again, to get the best out of this platform, you may need to budget for a paid subscription depending on the size of your audience. I know Dave mentioned it earlier, but I do also want to highlight CAP Network Ireland as a useful platform. We have a monthly e-bulletin, a website, and social media presence, and we'd be very happy to help you promote your project. And you can get in touch with us via our website contact form or at info@capnetworkireland.eu as well. Then the story. So science communication and jargon heavy detail can be hard for those not directly involved in the project to digest, especially if your audience includes the general public and the media. The key to effective communication is to take your stakeholders on a journey and connect with them through storytelling. Visuals and quotes from those involved can really emphasize the human angle of a project and help connections and understanding form. If, for example, you're trying to share positive farmer measures on farms with the general public via the media, then jargon and stating the facts won't be enough to capture their minds. You need to relate to people on a human and an emotional level, create empathy, and take the reader or a viewer on that journey so that they're rooting for you and your results. Key messages as well, you'll likely filter through a lot of your activities and help create the story around your project, its goals and objectives, and ultimately its impact for agriculture and society. So it's important to spend some time working out your key messages. And finally, don't be afraid to be creative. There's no limit to creativity. And I've read quite a few of the past EIP reports where projects, they've thought of some very creative ways to engage their target audience. An example that comes to mind was an adaptation of a study of participatory theatre as a very creative way to highlight farm safety measures. So there's really no limit to what you can do. And finally, evaluation. Probably the least amount of fun when it comes to communications, but it is a very important part of the process. So a lot of the time you'll want to show the reach that your measures and your activities have. Website analytics, social media analytics, some of them are free and contained within the platform like LinkedIn. Unfortunately, recently Twitter or X, you can no longer track analytics for free within the platform. If you're sharing stories with traditional media, you can ask the media for readership stats. They may not give you the exact readership, but you'll often get a good idea. Same with the newsletter tracking, and metrics from site visits via Google Analytics are all very useful. And once you know who to reach, why and how, it's good to set yourself some targets that can show progress over the course of the project and can also act as useful metrics or KPIs. They're key performance indicators. For example, if one of your goals is to raise awareness of the issue locally, you might set a target of reaching out to 200 people through existing Facebook communities and measure this via the engagement rate. Or maybe you have 3 farm open days with site visits, so up to 30 farmers can see the ongoing activities and get more engaged in the project. When you're showing the impact, consider the legacy of the project and what you want it to be. How will you share the results and potentially scalable outcomes? Will you reach out to academics, policymakers? Will you seek additional funding, build and grow the networks that you create throughout your project? These are all important things to consider to ensure that your project has the potential for lasting impact. And lastly, I just want to emphasize that these are just tips. You may already be working closely with these communities. You may already have a good idea of the types of actions to plan, but it is important to set these out in the project plan so that appropriate resources and budget can be allocated, and so that you can evaluate and measure success. And yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that. A lot of really interesting points, and I suppose getting to know who your audiences are, first of all, is a really important and crucial step, but also you framed it nicely for the next kind of point that we're going to discuss as well. This is going to inform your budget going forward in terms of the tools and resources that you need to get your information out there, and to highlight again that dissemination is such a key component of EIP Agri operation groups. Next, I'm going to pass over to Tony Ward from the Breeding Wader EIP, which is one of the largest EIPs in Ireland at the moment. Tony is the Chief Financial Officer. So, Tony, I'm going to share the screens for you, and if you want to turn on your camera and your microphone, you can kick off whenever you are ready.
Thanks a million, James. I hope you can hear me okay, can you?
Yeah, we can indeed.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So thanks for that. I suppose just to tell participants that the Breeding Waders EIP is a very recent, only very recently started. So we're still learning as we go along. So please don't hold me out as an expert on EIP, but I am an accountant, and I have worked with a number of different projects on grant applications and reporting in terms of public funding. So hopefully what I'm going to talk about is very relevant in the broad sense, although there's obviously detail that will be very specific to this EIP application cycle. So there's just a few slides. It's not going to take very long, but I'd be really happy to answer anyone's questions afterwards. So the first slide is basically just planning a budget for any grant application. It's not specific to the one that will come out tomorrow. And in fact, Dave earlier, I think, probably addressed some of these things in more detail. But really, in terms of a budget, you need to build it up from the ground. So there's no point in starting at the top and trying to work backwards. You know, you need to say, well, how many staff will we need to work on this? I heard Dave mention earlier that it's, you know, in explaining this whole FTE, full-time equivalent person, maybe you'll have somebody working on it part-time. So it's important to figure out exactly how many people you need, you know, to manage it, to work on it, and cost that out appropriately, either on a full-time equivalent or part-time equivalent basis. The project, as I understand it, is broadly divided into three areas. So there's the whole administrative side, then there's the possibility of farmer payments if that's actually going to be a feature of your project, and then there are the other operational costs. I'm not really going to talk about the farmer payments because it may not be relevant to everyone, and if anyone has queries, James and others here from the department know more about how that will work. So I'm going to mainly focus on the administrative side and perhaps other operational costs. So as I mentioned, salaries, if that's how you're going to actually get people to work on the project, either seconded from existing staff or hired in new, work out their actual costs. You'll probably have to work it out on a multi-year level. So if this project is starting, as Tracy said earlier, potentially in November, obviously 2024 is only 2 months out of whereas 2025 might be 12 months or whatever. So sometimes you know, the costs will have to be apportioned depending on the period of time they cover. For salaries, for example, and I know people know this, but don't forget it, you have employers' PRSI, which is 11%. You may have employer pension commitments if the lead provider has a company pension and you have to make a contribution to that. That will be a cost. Actually, referring back to another point, which was a question about could you have contractors working as distinct from employees, and I heard the answer to that was that you could. Well, if they are registered for VAT, or indeed if any of the costs, either administrative wise or other operational wise, have VAT, that rate is usually 23%. And it's just having clarity around that, because often if you ask somebody how much is it for X, they'll say, let's say €1,000. Well, you know, it could be €1,000 plus VAT. So that's a really important consideration to have and to put it into your budget, because if you find it out in a year's time or 2 years' time, and suddenly you don't have the budget for it because you didn't know it when you were submitting it, it's sort of too late at that point. So administrative costs, other operational costs will tend to be either direct or indirect. So direct costs that are associated with the project are probably easy enough to identify. So they're things that you need to do that are very specific to this project, and you're going to be identifying those in your activity plan. The indirect costs are probably trickier. I've used the word trickier there because they often need to be apportioned. This happens with lots of funding generally, where organizations have multiple sources of funding, and you need to have a basis for any such apportionment. So it can't just be, well, listen, we'll charge the project €1,000 a month for rent or €500 a month for this. You actually need to have an apportionment policy, which is usually based either on the head count. So let's say one person working on this project in an office with 4 people, that would be a quarter, or on a square footage. I suppose it's slightly less relevant maybe, or even maybe trickier now in people working remotely and so on, but it doesn't really matter as long as there is a basis for the apportionment, because I'm sure whenever the checking part of it happens, and if you have audits or checks from funders, they're going to look for this type of information. So the final point I have there on that slide, which again I think was probably answered earlier by Michelle, be sure that whatever you're looking for is within the parameters of the funding available. So if the total funding available, let's say, is €500,000, there's no point in putting in the project that's going to cost €1 million. So I've mentioned match funding there, which Michelle more or less said earlier that that's unlikely to be a feature, which is fair enough. But I think you have to make sure when you're building this up from the bottom that whatever answer you get, when you get the whole of project cost, it doesn't exceed the budget that's available. So that's the last point there. James, I'll make one last point and you can flick on to the next slide. Again, if this is an online application, it's often a really good idea to work it out before you start to input it, because sometimes when you're inputting something onto an online platform, you get stuck, you know, because when you click the next button, the next screen asks you a question that you hadn't previously thought about. So it's often a good idea to get your figures down in a spreadsheet and work them all out, so that essentially when you come to any online process, you're plugging them in rather than thinking about them for the very first time. So that's the broad parameters of the budget planning. The next slide is on risk, which is again, people are probably familiar with this from dealing with their ordinary other organizations like activities. But risk is an important thing from an organizational whole of organization point of view, but also it can be very important and relevant for a project like this project. So you want to know yourself, and indeed the funder wants to know that, you know, the risks have been assessed and understood and you have an approach to them. It can often be a very useful exercise to undertake, because sometimes even by doing the exercise yourself, you can come up with something that you never thought of before, or never thought of in so many terms before. So it's not just because the funder needs it exercise, it's actually a really useful thing to do internally. And broadly speaking, and again, without going into too much detail, you probably need to have a policy. We can make one available afterwards that was developed and shared by the Wheel, which is the organisation representing charities and not-for-profits in Ireland. So I can give that to you later, James. But the policy doesn't have to be overly complicated. It just basically has to set out what you're doing and why you're doing it, and how you're going to do it. In terms of drilling down into any risk register, what you're really trying to do is develop headings or categories, and I've outlined 5 of them there: governance, finance, operations, compliance, and reputation, but there could be other ones. And then what you're trying to do within each one is identify some specific risks that could, if they're high or not mitigated against, could cause problems. So again, without getting into too much detail in this tight time frame, you're basically trying to weight the impact and likelihood of each risk. And depending on the answer you get from that exercise, and I've given an example there of 1 by 1 equals 1, and 2 by 2 equals 4, 3 by 3 equals 9, you can sort of flush out whether they're low, medium, or high. And then the low ones are probably fine. Medium are, probably need a bit of attention, but you don't want anything to be high risk. So it's a process and a methodology for identifying risks and measuring them and staying on top of them. So it's an important feature. I can make some documentation available to James for circulation afterwards. They're not the Bible by any manner or means, but for anyone who's not familiar with this, it'll give you some sense of how it works. So that's risk management, James. If you want to flick on to the last slide. So there's just a few things here that we wanted to pick out that are important. Procurement, obviously, procurement is important generally, and especially important with public funding. There are different guidelines depending on the funding source itself. So I'm sure the department will point towards the particular procurement guidelines for this EIP application process or running these projects. But broadly speaking, if the service is less than €5,000, 3 verbal quotes, a minimum of 3 verbal quotes, is usually okay. Although personally, I prefer myself, regardless, to go to the next level, because it's not that big of a jump. And between 5 and 25,000, 3 written quotes. So I think that's a safer landing space. And then if you're more than 25,000, you may have to enter into the whole e-tenders world of e-tenders, which is it has its own rules and regulations in terms of how to go about it. But I suspect for projects in this cycle, you're probably not going to be acquiring services that go beyond the 25,000. But anyway, be mindful if you are. And the other thing to note about procurement, which I haven't noted there, is that it's cumulative. So, if you end up getting a service, let's say for 2,500, and then in 6 months' time, you need another 2,500 from the same supplier, and then you need another 2,500. It may be organic and legitimate, but you may need to retrospectively make sure that you've complied with the procurement guidance, because at that point it will have tipped into the next threshold. So that's just really a note to take account of procurement. Also a note there to take account of the public service mileage and travel and subsistence rates. You may be familiar with those. They're, I suppose I could call them complex, but they're complex in a good way nowadays, in that they take account of the type of car you drive, and if it's an e-car, for example, there are different rates there. Obviously, the preferred approach is to use the most cost-effective method of transport, but I guess in rural Ireland, that's probably going to be a car. But if it's beyond that, there are public transport options, and there are travel and subsistence guidance as well. So there's a link there with the latest revenue approved and civil service used travel and subsistence guidelines. And then the final point on the slide there is about bank accounts. So it is often the case, and I think it is the case with this program as well, that you have a separate bank account. That to my mind is actually a good thing, because it helps to keep the thing very ring fenced and separate. And I've made a few points there. You can often rename or redesignate an existing bank account rather than going into the bank and opening up another bank account. And the reason I would encourage that is because it's actually poor governance potentially for an organization to have far too many bank accounts. It's a risk factor in itself. So anyway, you will likely need a separate bank account. Obviously, you need to change and update any authorized signatories and so on. It can be a good thing to keep it separate because, again, for checking and auditing purposes, it just leaves a much clearer and straightforward audit trail, which is helpful both for you managing the project and anyone coming to audit the activities of the project. So I think that's it, James. I know that's a bit rapid, quick fire through those 3 slides, but if obviously you're sharing them with attendees and the recording's been shared, but I'm happy to answer any questions if I can.
Perfect. Tony, thanks very much. And there's some really important things, I suppose, that we need to be mindful of there. And I think Tony always has a way of speaking about topics that generally scare most people and giving confidence there. So you actually outlined that a lot of the measures there are positive that we should all be aware of as well and can actually really inform for people for the betterment of the product. So that's really important. So look, there is some questions coming in, Tony, but I'm just going to go to the last speaker first of all, and then I'll come back to questions in terms of the topic you've just spoken about. The final presentation today is from Anne McGuire from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and she is the Assistant Principal in the locally led section. And so you're sharing your slides there. Over to you, please.
Thanks very much, James. As James said, I'm working in the EIP division and with Michelle and Tracy and Seamus. And I'm just going to cover a little bit about the operational group guidelines. So this is just an overview of what the operational group under EIPs is. Locally led schemes developed and led by operational groups acting collaboratively for a common goal. Operational groups are made up of stakeholders, and that's the full range: farmers, researchers, advisors, NGOs, foresters, community groups, and businesses who have a shared interest in achieving the objectives of the EIP. The project plan, as we've discussed already throughout the presentation today, should set out clearly all the actors who will be members of the OG to the best of your ability. And it set out each of the roles and the contributions of each of the members, and clearly identify who the lead partner is. There may also be either a separate project manager or the same project manager, and if that person can be identified, that's also helpful. And the lead partner of the OG has responsibility for ensuring that the other partners are aware of their roles and responsibilities. So that's kind of a significant role for the lead partner. They're not quite the same as the other partners. They're taking the lead and they're taking responsibility for how the OG operates. There must be at least 2 entities in the OG, and I think we've made that clear up to now. The other thing just to bear in mind is that you can make a change to the OG, either based the OG that you presented in the expression of interest, or else even after the project has started. We know that there's a certain amount of churn or people, circumstances change and they may leave, but any change to the OG should be notified as soon as possible to the department's OG, to the department's EIP section. The contract between, and just going to go briefly into this. So once the successful groups have been advised of their success, a service level agreement will be put in place. And I just wanted to go down through what will be in this in terms of our contract with the successful project operational groups. So we have a service level agreement and a protocol for implementation. So it's a joint document is put in place between the Department of Agriculture and the operational group, outlining what we expect from the OG, and it'll go into all the roles and responsibilities of the operational group and also of what the department has as well. They address the obligations of both groups under relevant regulations, and they cover areas such as the service to be provided, and they've referred to this earlier on with the project plan. The project plan and the guideline document, which we're going to issue to you after this webinar, they basically form the substance of the service to be provided. So whatever is in the project plan is what the expectation is that will be part of the contract, and that's what you are being contracted to deliver. the payments process and the management of funds, and we have certain templates that we would use for that, for making claims and setting up budgets. Confidentiality and data protection, which, as we know, is huge area to be considered. Dealing with problems, conflicts, disputes, and terminations would be part of the contract, the document as well. The governance framework to be adopted, how we do record keeping and reporting, and the dissemination of outputs and learnings, which you've already heard about earlier on. As well as the contract between the department and the protocol between the department and the OG within the operational group. We would give you a template for an operational group agreement. The operational group agreement is put in place between all the members of the OG, that to make clear the roles and responsibilities of all the partners of the operational groups. The provisions of the project plan, against what's in the project plan, including any annexes, are directly applicable to the operational group agreement. So again, they would the project plan is key to what the operational group members are agreeing to implement, and the signatories of that operational group agreement understand and accept their joint responsibility to implement the project plan. I'll leave it at that then. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anne, for that, and for all the speakers so far. There's some really interesting stuff there that I suppose the operation groups and the potential attendees on today's call need to be aware of as well. We are at the Q&A session now, so I do encourage people to please write as many questions as they can think of into the questions and answers box, and we will get through as many as we can. I'd also like to invite some of the previous speakers from the department as well, if you want to turn on your camera as well, with some of the questions. It might be applicable to yourselves along with some of the previous speakers as well. My colleague Paddy Malone has kindly submitted a post-evaluation survey in the chat box there, please, and we would encourage participants to please fill it out and give us your feedback on today's events. It's really important for us to improve our, offering to groups going forward. So we do really welcome that feedback as well. So I'll dive into a couple of questions if that is okay. So I suppose there's a lot of questions, Tony, for you there, and you mentioned risk as well, and we will share that document that you spoke about. What kind of risks are most common out there, and what should groups be aware of going in? I know you mentioned some, but if you might go into a bit further detail on that. And just one other question, Tony, maybe when you're feeling that is actually related to some of the projects here might be classed as educational. So are they applicable to the lower rate of tax, or sorry, lower rate of VAT, I should say? So just two questions really, please.
James, those two questions, I could take 15 minutes to answer the two of them, maybe, but let's try, I'll do my best. So in terms of risk, I mean, there's a whole load of risks that you could classify as governance, finance, HR, whatever. And I would sort of, in my brain, say that they're about doing the right things in the right way. And I think that's really important. So for smaller organizations, and especially if they're, in this operational group type of approach to this program, there needs to be a joint ownership, I guess, between the operational group. Yet somebody's going to be a lead partner. So the other group members need to know that organization has systems in place. So things I would think of, for example, are that, there's two-factor authentication on online banking. That there's policies, that there are contracts in place for staff, that there's proper, staff reviews, annual reviews, that type of thing. So it's about, I suppose, doing your things right and making sure, especially with people, because an awful lot of this is about people, after all, making sure that people have correct contracts and there are staff handbooks and there's leave entitlements and all those sort of things I would put into one bucket, I suppose, of risks. And they're big. If they go wrong, they can go very wrong. The other one, I suppose, and I would think in particular in relation to this being a new project for whoever the winning operational groups are, is the delivery side of stuff. So you can have the best intention in the world of delivering an innovative project under the EIP, but will it get off the ground? Will you be able to do what you want to do? Obviously there's a reputation, which is one of the ones I mentioned there, at play, both for the operational group and the department and the other stakeholders, So I think for me, if I was to simplify it, I would say one is about actually being able to do, broadly speaking, in the time frame, what you plan to do with the stakeholders all involved. And the second one is about having procedures in place that allow you to do that in a very safe and well-controlled way. So that's as simple as I can sort of, if you like, drill that down into what the risks might be. The other one is about VAT, James. So broadly speaking, most non-profit groups are not registered for VAT. Now there are exceptions to that, but broadly speaking, most non-profits are not registered for VAT. That means that you don't charge VAT on your services or whatever you do, nor indeed do you have to account for VAT on funding like the EIP funding. But the other side of that is that you can't claim back VAT on any of your inputs. So I mean, I think for most organizations, whether it's educational or not educational, it doesn't really matter, because it seems to me it's unlikely. Like take Irish Rural Link, for example. Irish Rural Link isn't registered for VAT because it's not obliged to, and it's not even entitled to. So if organizations potentially applying for this EIP funding are similar non-profits, I don't really think VAT's going to come into it, except to the extent they need to build it into their input costs if there's VAT in their input costs. So I hope that might have answered it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tony. And I suppose linked to that, and a question for yourself: will the EIP need to set up a CLG as past projects have?
Yeah, I'll take that one, James.
Oh,
Yeah.
perfect.
So in order for the operational group to get paid, it has to be a legal entity. So it is important, yeah, that they would set up as a CLG.
Okay, perfect. Just a question here as well. Can operational group members, in brackets farmers, be paid for their time? And if so, at what rate? Can you clarify if setting up a dedicated bank account is a nice to have or a requirement? And then I'll come to another question after that. That's okay. So, Anne or Tracy or Michelle, I'm not sure if one of you guys can take that question.
Yeah, I was just looking at that question there now. Okay, so the EIPs do need to set up a dedicated bank account. And generally, if there's farmer payments,
Okay.
they need two dedicated bank accounts. So they did one for administration and they did one for farmer payments. And that's to do with the budgets that they come out of from our point of view. So it is a dedicated bank account specifically for the funds for EIP.
And to Tony's point, that can be an existing one if there's no other activity in the account and it's solely for this project. Is that correct?
As long as it's solely used for the purpose of EIP.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much. Just another kind of add-on to that question. Can someone please speak about the reporting requirements, audits, etc.? Someone else kind of referenced that above. How reporting heavy will the department want from the project updates? So I suppose there's a general question there about reporting and audits, etc. If Anne or Tracy or Michelle wants to, I don't know if anyone in particular. You're just on mute, Anne. I think if you're going to speak there.
Yeah, in terms of the reporting, that would be certainly clarified for successful projects when they are up and running. There would be at the least under the CAP strategic plan, we would have templates from the CAP strategic plan. It's or you can actually view them on the EU CAP network website, and they're basically to outline what the project is doing and the objectives, the key performance indicators they're using to measure those objectives, and how they're doing. A lot of the reporting is basically on the number of participants and expenditure. And I just maybe pass on to Tracy for the auditing part.
Okay, what's the question in relation to auditing specifically? Is there?
Just generally, what is required around auditing and stuff like that, there's no particular question. It just said if someone could speak to it around reporting requirements and auditing.
Okay, so the administration audits would happen kind of throughout the lifetime of the project. And we would be looking at from the administration side on the governance element of it, in relation to data protection, GDPR, conflict of interest. And there would also be audits then on the financial aspect. There would be on the spot checks by the inspectors over the lifetime of the project as well.
Kind of linked to that as well, and then I'll move on to another topic is there an estimated amount of hours that will kind of be required for that engagement with you guys in terms of the reporting, all that type of thing? Is there a standardized kind of approximation of time just when groups are trying to do their budgeting, if they need to know maybe how much of an administration person's time is going to be needed for that side of things? I presume it's a case by case, but you might be able to give a little bit more detail.
No, it definitely is on a case by case basis, and the KPIs and the outputs for the project. I mean, it all depends on how much staff, the level of staff that they're going to have as well, but it differs for every project.
But I suppose, James, and just to add to that from a department perspective, yes, we have the project plan, and Anne has referred to, I suppose, the reporting that's required under the CSP and EIP-Agri. But in addition to that, we would be expecting six monthly reports in terms of progress and in terms of matching that or tracking the KPIs as part of that plan. And I suppose we will be looking at it from both an administrative perspective, but also from a technical perspective. And just to mention as well is, you know, that these projects will also inform policy. So we will be monitoring what is the information here, or how could the, you know, the information or the findings, even at a very early stage, inform policy into the future. So that's what we will be looking at for on a 6 monthly basis. But as Tracy said, it very much depends on the size and scale and nature of the project.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, I suppose, with the next consultation process starting for the next CSP. You know, you guys are going to require that information, you know, as soon as possible as well if there's key findings. Sarah, just in terms of the communications, is there any preferred or preference toward different types of communication channels or tools that you would recommend? I suppose you've outlined a few of them there. If there's any in particular that you would like to maybe spotlight.
I suppose it really depends on your audience. Like it's hard to recommend one without knowing who the audience is. I would say from reading other projects and just knowing what I know about the sector, I would say in-person events seem to be very popular if there's some form of peer-to-peer learning. If you do have an older cohort of people that you're trying to reach, maybe more towards traditional media and brochures or leaflets, less, you know. Videos are very popular in terms of social media, like the constantly TikTok and everything is taken over. Farmers of all ages watch TikTok, but YouTube is still very popular as well. Yeah, and then the traditional email newsletter, but to be honest, yeah, videos and in-person communication is probably a good shout.
Can I just
Thanks
add
very
there,
much.
James?
Yeah.
There's the EU Farm Book is now a dedicated website for projects, and the EIP projects are currently being uploaded onto the EU Farm Book. So it may save a project from setting up their own website. You know, they don't have the expense of that if they want to upload their parts of the project as they're going, and it takes videos and all that, leaflets and brochures, all that kind of stuff.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, I
Tracy,
will
with
just
that.
add actually, in terms of just websites, Squarespace and WordPress, like you can set up free websites there. So if cost is a concern for setting up a website, I will consider those platforms as well.
Thanks, Sarah, for that. Tony, it's referenced to you here, but it's probably a question as well for the department as well. Regarding staff, and Tony, you've talked about contractors versus employees. Is it the case, are the employees employed by the project itself, or DAFM? How does this work? So I suppose this is contractors. Who is actually the employees of these? Is it DAFM or is it the operation group itself?
Well, I don't know,
if
maybe if Tracy or somebody, I'm 99.9% sure it's the operational group and that CLG that Tracy mentioned. It's
Yeah.
that the AFM are just the funders. Is that right, guys?
That's correct. Yeah. The
Yeah,
staff
yeah,
will be
yeah.
employed by the operational group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing important just to add on to that, James, and I was thinking about this based on the earlier our earlier discussion about staff versus contractors. Like, just be careful as well, because I mean, you can't essentially hire somebody on a full-time basis and call them a contractor. You know, revenue have guidance as to whether something is a contract of employment or a contract for employment. So, you know, broadly speaking, if somebody comes to work with you and that's their only job and they have all of the normal things that an employee has, such as, you know, holiday leave and bank holidays off and that type of thing, they're an employee, they're not a contractor. So it's you know, organizations need to be careful that they're complying with the general revenue definitions of what's an employee.
It's very much, Tony, and I suppose kind of linked to that as well. What is the approach for maternity cover within operational groups? I would imagine that is general law that applies to these projects the same as it would to normal projects and employers. I wouldn't imagine there's any difference here. If anyone wants to just clarify that.
No, like that, if they're an employee of the operational group, it's normal employment law that they're covered under.
Great, thanks very much. Just again to reiterate this point, there's a question about can operational group members who will or who could be directors of the CLG be paid for their work services, or is this a conflict of interest being a director of the company? So how does that equate? Someone, are they able to be a director of the company but also be paid as well? So I don't know if someone from the department wants to clarify that again.
Go ahead.
No, I'll just say that, I don't think it matters whether the director of the company or not. It's the same as the full-time equivalent that Tony was talking about. You put in the amount of hours that you're working on the project, and you can invoice for that, and all the payments are made on a vouched expenditure basis, and that includes time spent working on the project by all the members of the OG or any of the members of the OG.
Mm. And James, can I just add on to what Anne said there? Just be careful. I know, you know, a CLG isn't a charity, but it is a company limited by guarantee, so it doesn't have a share capital and it has a membership. It's based on, you know, a sort of a not-for-profit membership model. So just be careful about a director also being an employee, because essentially what that means is you have authority over yourself, so to speak, you know. So I think it would be important, even if it isn't written down in the rules of the EIP, that there's a segregation of duties, you know, so that the people who are on the board of directors of that CLG are not actually also benefiting, you know, because I just think that creates a conflict.
Thanks very much, Tony, for that. One final question here. Would smaller projects, is there any guidance on the number of employees for smaller projects of this size? I don't know if anyone wants to take that in particular. I would imagine, again, it's a case by case basis.
Yeah. Every project is different, you know, and it depends on the outputs, the KPIs, and what their goals are of the project, just to minute how many people they really need.
Yeah, I think that goes back to David Barry's previous presentation, where you need to clearly set out what you want to achieve, what you need to do it, and the resources to do it, and then figure out the number of employees, whether they need to be full-time equivalents or part-time or whatever the case may be. So it's about getting your plan in place, and then you can figure out the resources that need to deliver that plan in the most cost-effective way. I think would be a kind of fair comment on it. Some of the OG in the expression of interest are now not available. Do I just not include them in the next phase? So if someone's operation group essentially has changed, can they be removed, or is that going to affect their application? We've already said that you can find new operation group partners, but what about the previous ones? So Anne or Tracy or
Yeah.
Michelle, if anyone wants
Yes,
to
you
comment.
can. Yeah, for the full application, you are basically starting with from scratch with the operational group, in the sense that you can you can change members that would have been included in the original expression of interest.
Thanks very much. Guys, I'm going to finish up there in terms of the questions and answers, because we've got through a lot and we're just over time as we normally are in these situations. But just to reflect as well, if there's any questions and stuff for the managing authority, there is a dedicated email address, and Tracy, that I assume will be circulated tomorrow in the packs as well, for people's further information if they have any further questions that they need clarifying. So,
Correct.
or if not, if you want, you can even put that into chat beforehand. Very quickly, I'm just going to pass over to Michelle if you want to say anything final, and then I'll just do some housekeeping to finish off. So, Michelle, I don't know if you want to say a few words just before we finish up.
Yeah, James. So just look to say again, to thank you to yourselves for putting on, I suppose, a very good and excellent set of presentations here. And just to say, look, that we are looking forward to receiving these proposals. As you said, we have both an email address and telephone line. We're open to answer any type of question, any type of query that anybody has, in terms of both directed to us within the department or through James through the network as well. So we just look forward, James, to receiving very interesting proposals. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Yeah, and similar from ourselves, we're looking very much forward to working with the operational groups that are successful, and for those that are unsuccessful maybe in this call, we look forward to working with them again on future applications. And there's definitely possibilities. If an application is missing something now, there's nothing to be said that it can't move forward. So just from my own side, I would like to thank the range of speakers that we've had today: David, Michelle, Tony, Sarah, and Tracy, etc. I hope I haven't left out in there as well. And for my own team, for all their help as well. As I said, this webinar was recorded. We will share it before the end of the week. The information pack will also be included, which will have the presentation and the evaluation survey for anyone that didn't get to fill it out on this call. As I said, we do appreciate your feedback, and it's really constructive for us to improve our webinars and our work going forward. And I just again like to thank everyone for attending today, and we'll endeavour to get the resources out as quick as we can. And Tony, in addition, mentioned some more that we will add to our information pack. So we look forward to working with the groups in the future, and please do contact us if you have any questions. And thanks for your attention. We'll see you again soon. Bye.